Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kies. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as my manner is, I'm very excited about today's show. I'm always excited about today's show, but today I get to introduce a new concept that's actually really not all that new. It's just that this is a really concise way of stating what I'm driving at here, which is the title of today's show, and this is probably going to become a recurring theme, is Read the Bible Again for the First Time. Read the Bible again for the first time. Subtitle, Rethinking Modern Expectations Imposed on an Ancient Text. Now there's more to it than that, because what I've come to realize when this title came to me, a big part of what I came to realize is the fact that this is what God Save the King has been about for a long time. For those of you that are new to my show, that maybe have not heard me before, and for those of you that may be already very familiar with what God Save the King is all about, what God Save the King is all about is the nativity story. That's my passion. My passion is retelling the nativity story the way it really would have happened. And that's because the nativity story, frankly, has been kind of hijacked. And it's been hijacked into this quaint little convenient, commercially packaged story that we hear every year at quote unquote Christmas time. And number one, that isn't when it happened. Jesus was not born in the winter. Jesus was born in the fall. And that one fact alone, when you correct it, starts a domino effect of other facts that therefore have to fall down and have to get corrected as you do it. If you place it in the fall, you come to realize, for example, that the Christmas carol, the first Noel, the angels did say, was to certain poor shepherds in field where they lay, right? The first Noel, which means the first Christmas, which I've talked about before, which is actually an intellectually dishonest concept, okay? So to call the nativity the first Christmas, there we go. That is exactly what I'm talking about here when I say read the Bible again, for as if it was for the first time, guarding against and rethinking, superimposing, or imposing modern concepts, modern expectations on an ancient text. We need to let the ancient text speak for itself. So, like I said, this is new in a way, but in a way, it's not new at all, because this is what I have been talking about for years, is to rethink the story that we think we know. We think we know the nativity story, and the reality of it is that we probably don't. And if that's true, how about other stories in the Bible where we think we know the story, and maybe it's time that we should rethink it, especially in light of the fact that it is an ancient text. It's not a modern text. It's an ancient text, and it was written halfway around the world, which means that the intended audience was the local audience at that time, and that's not us. That's not us. So that is probably the first rule and the most important rule that is required when interpreting the Bible, when understanding Scripture, is that we cannot superimpose or impose our modern expectations on an ancient text that was written halfway around the world. We just can't do that. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we do a lot of the time. Now, and part of the reason I'm excited about this, a big part of the reason I'm excited about this, frankly, is because there are so many things in the Bible that are going to fall under this heading. I pretty much guarantee you that, this is going to be part one, and you're going to see part 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's going to become a very, very common thing for me to cite this as the title of today's episode is Read the Bible Again for the First Time, part 37, because there are so many things that can fall under this heading. Just in my notes. Okay, so my notes are right here next to me on my computer screen so that I can at least try to look in the camera and then read my notes at the same time. And right here are the bullet points for my show today. And I don't know which one of these I'm going to talk about, or some of them, most of them, all of them, none of them. But these are the bullet points, ladies and gentlemen. These are the bullet points. Listen to this list. I wrote down the doctrine of inerrancy. Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about the radical claims on either side of the doctrine of inerrancy. We'll talk about that in a minute. I'll explain exactly what that is, right? Let's talk about biblical hermeneutics. Let's talk about the literal method of interpretation and what that means, taking the Bible, quote unquote, literally. Let's talk about the fact that the Bible is an ancient book. Let's talk about the fact that the Bible is intended to be understood using the normal rules of language, but that means the normal rules of language 2,000 years ago, not the normal rules of language today necessarily. Okay, let's talk about the fact that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 needs to be understood as epic poetry. It's history and it's accurate, it's true, it's a truth proposition. We're going to talk about that, but that doesn't mean that it is literal. So something can be true without being literal. I've talked about that in other episodes. Let's talk about the writer's intent. Let's talk about the writer's intent to be trustworthy and reliable. Okay, I believe that that is absolutely the writer's intent. Let's talk about scientific accuracy versus scientific inaccuracy and what I'm going to call appearance, the appearance of truth. Okay, we're going to talk about that, or we're going to try to, right? I mentioned this already. What about a truth proposition versus the way that truth is expressed? A truth proposition versus the way that truth is expressed. And that can dovetail right into what I mentioned before, which is scientific accuracy or inaccuracy, especially in the symbolic and poetic sections of Scripture. See, so this is why we need to read the Bible again for the first time. Let's talk about how my understanding of my own subject matter, God Save the King, the Nativity, has changed over years of discovery. That there's things that I know today that I didn't know 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, 15, 20, 30, or 40 years ago when this project started. Okay, I have been researching Nativity for 35 to 40 years, and every time I turn around, I learn something new about the Nativity story. Something new historically, something new archaeologically, something new astronomically that affects how I understand the story and what it really would have looked like. So my understanding has changed. Let's talk about archaeology. Let's talk about the hundreds of thousands of clay tablets that have been retrieved from the deserts of Iran and Iraq, what would be ancient Mesopotamia, and the fact that now they are being translated like never before. When I first started my research, only a handful of these tablets had ever been translated. Now there's many, many more of them have been translated. And what does that understanding lead to? Because this is interesting. Think about, because what an amazing paradigm we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that we do have the benefit of modern technology. Modern technology helps us reveal a great many things that could not have been revealed, once again, 5, 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years ago. The difference in what a biblical scholar has available to them today compared to what a biblical scholar had available to them 100 years ago. That makes me wonder what these scholars would have concluded, right? Would they have reached a different conclusion if they had had different sources and resources available to them? Well, once it stands to reason that of course they would, that if they had different resources available, right? What sources did they or did they not have available to them? So let's talk about this. Let's jump into this a little bit. Let's talk about this. Here are a couple of 2-3 ideas that are in God Save the King that are fundamental to the story that I have actually changed my understanding of over the years as I have gotten new information. And thankfully, that is something that I have adhered to for quite some time, is that I reserve the right to change my mind if and when I discover new information. If I discover something new, then I reserve okay. The skeptics do not get to say you were wrong. If I had old information, I can review the new information and I can change my mind. Skeptics, sorry guys, you don't get to say, oh, well, the Bible's wrong. The Bible's wrong. See, and that's why I brought up at the very outset this issue of the doctrine of inerrancy and the radical claims that are on either side of that. We're going to talk about that a little bit. The doctrine of inerrancy is the idea that the Bible in its original form was inerrant, that it contained no errors. Well, what does that mean? What do you mean it contains no errors? Does it mean it contained no factual errors, or does it simply mean it contained no grammatical errors? What does that mean? It contained no scientific errors? Because, boy, you can drive a truck through that one. Okay. And what about appearances? What about the way things appear? Like, here's a good example, right? When in normal language, both today and probably back then, right? Because we read the Bible, we read statements in the Bible, right? Here's a great example. It's a colloquialism that is in every language known to man, right? Well, when the sun rose earlier today, right? Okay, when the sun rose. Well, that is actually a poetic statement. That is not actually scientific accuracy. It's not. The sun didn't rise. No, that's a perception. Okay, that's because we stand, vertically on the earth, right? And where am I? I'm outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I'm guessing we're at something like, this is a total radical guess. What are we? Maybe about 25 degrees north latitude, maybe. I remember the town I grew up in was in exactly 30 degrees, if I remember right. I think it's 30. I hope I'm remembering that right. Roseville, Minnesota. Though my friends out there, I'm sure will correct me. What was the latitude there? North latitude, 30 degrees, right? Okay, so here it is outside of Philadelphia. What are we, 25 degrees north latitude? Something like that, right? But if you think about it, we're quote unquote on the side, so to speak, in a way, of the earth, right? And it's gravity that allows us to stand quote unquote upright when in reality we're kind of sideways, right? But if I look to the east, I watch the sun rise in the morning. If I look to the west, I watch the sun set at night. But that isn't actually what's happening. What's happening is the earth is rotating. Sun isn't going, yeah, the sun is on its own course through the universe. Okay. But it's, so what we don't do in everyday life, we don't do this in everyday life, and they don't do it in the Bible, is we don't say, well, when the sun rotated earlier today pardon me, see, I just did it right there. When the earth rotated on its axis earlier today, and it appears as if the sun came up above the horizon, we don't talk like that. See? So when we talk about the doctrine of inerrancy, do we make room for a statement like that? Because frankly, we have to. And that's what I hinted at earlier when I said that the Bible needs to be understood according to the normal rules of language, both now and 2,000 years ago. How did they talk 2,000 years ago? How did they write 2,000 years ago? Because the Bible is an ancient book. And now a lot of the rules remain the same, this notion of appearances, right? So let's talk about 2 or 3 examples in God Save the King where I have learned more over time, and therefore I have had to read the Bible again for the first time and therefore change my mind because I had an expectation that I started with and then learned more and realized, oh, that isn't what that looks like, right? And like I said, once again, I reserve the right to change my mind. That if I discover new information that's better, then I reserve the right to change my mind. There it is. So, for example, Luke, the gospel writer, skeptics love to poke at Luke. They love to read the first 2 to 3 chapters of Luke because it has a lot of chronological and historical information and go, oh, well, see, that's not right. See, we know that's not right. Historical records show that that's not right. Okay, well, but is that the only historical record? And is there a new historical record that we're going to find tomorrow? Right? Plus, that dismisses, which is what they love to do. They love to dismiss the Bible as an historical record and say, oh, yeah, well, by the way, the Bible doesn't count. You don't get to count the Bible. And by the way, I forgot to do this earlier. Let me do it right now. I just realized this. Here I am recording my show both for radio and for video. Now, on radio, you can't see this, but you can on video. I'm going to turn this on right now. This is the banner at the bottom of the screen, right? So now the banner at the bottom of the screen gives my broadcast time, and then it gives my website, but it also says God Save the King, where we rescue truth from familiarity. See, that's been one of my taglines for quite some time, is that's what we try to do here. We try to rescue truth from familiarity. We're so used to the familiar version of a story that we don't stop and think and go, wow, was it really like that? Or am I just accepting a certain idea, right? So back to what I said about certain ideas that have changed over time, right? So I started with the fact that Luke is frequently attacked by skeptics as being a bad historian. They say, see, we know that this isn't true, and therefore the Bible is not true, and therefore we need to just throw the Bible away because the Bible is all just lies and untruths and it's false and everything like that. Well, I'm calling that out and saying, cow cookies. Okay, that is not what the Bible is about. Number one, you don't get to just categorically reject it as a historical source because here it is, because we are learning more all the time. See, and this is what happens is, sorry to say, is that you've got skeptics who, frankly, they've got an agenda. They want to prove the Bible is false. That is their agenda. And therefore, what do they find? They find ways that they believe, quote unquote, prove that the Bible is false. But now, here we go. Now hang on there. If you're a skeptic listening to my show, okay, now wait, because I'm going to take on the other side too, right? Because here's the other side of the matter, is the other side of the matter are the hyper conservative and frankly hyper religious Christians who want to say, well, if this statement in the Bible isn't true, well, then the whole Bible just falls apart. And see, I don't know that that's true either. I haven't believed that like ever, really, and I went to an extremely conservative Bible college where I got that kind of language thrown at me, and thankfully I didn't really buy it. that they kept saying, well, if this isn't true and that isn't true and this isn't true, well, then, the Bible just falls apart and you can just throw it away and da 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 da. So you got both ends of the spectrum here. You got hyper conservative Christian believers telling you that the Bible must absolutely be true, and even sometimes claiming scientifically. Oh, see, and that's a problem, like I just said, right, with the whole thing about the rising of the sun, because I'm sorry, that's poetic language that we use to describe the quote unquote rising of the sun every day, when scientifically that isn't what's going on. It's the Earth's rotation and okay, right? But then, so you've got the hyper conservative Christians claiming that the Bible must absolutely be true and it's absolutely inerrant in its original form and dot, 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 right? And then you got the flip side, which is the skeptic saying, yeah, if we find even one tiny little thing that is scientifically inaccurate, well, then that proves that the Bible is completely wrong from beginning to end, because if any part of the answer is false, then the whole answer is false, right? And see, and neither of these is true, because number one, how can we agree on the doctrine of inerrancy if we can't agree on the definition of the doctrine of inerrancy? Because that's where you got to start. Okay, we have to define what it is we agree or disagree on. See? And therefore, if we define the doctrine of inerrancy as that there cannot be one single grammatical, factual, scientific error, okay, well then, if we agree, which I don't, by the way, okay, that if we agree that if you find even one scientific inaccuracy in the Bible, throw it away. Well, if you agree that's the standard, then you should have already thrown it away by now. I mean, there it is, right? If that's what you believe the standard is. But if the standard is something more like this, right, that there are truth propositions in the Bible, there are truths that are being expressed, and it's the truth that is being expressed that is inerrant, not how it is being expressed. Okay, so there's a difference between the truth proposition that is being put forth by the biblical writer and how that biblical writer is putting that truth forward. Okay, so we spent several episodes under the title of, where did Cain get his wife, right? If you look at my archives on Rumble or on YouTube, or the podcast, or on the Truth Be Told Radio Network website, whichever format you prefer to follow God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, if you look at the archives, you will find several shows entitled Where Did Cain Get His Wife? And we spent a significant amount of time looking at Genesis chapters 1, 2, 3, 4 in particular, but also Genesis 1 through 11. And I firmly believe that Genesis 1 through 11 needs to be treated as if it were epic poetry. Okay, as if it were epic poetry, because see, now we're getting into this understanding. Read the Bible again for the first time. Read it according to the normal rules of language. Well, one of the normal rules of language in many cultures throughout the world for a long time has been a tradition of epic poetry. Okay, primordial epic poetry. Primordial meaning it speaks about the beginnings of the heavens and the earth, the beginnings of the human race, our primordial beginnings, our ancient history. Where did we come from? How did we get here? And primordial stories, both biblical and non-biblical, frequently make use of non-literal language. They make use of poetic language. That doesn't mean it's not true. It simply means it's not literal. Back to our sun rising example. The sunrise and the sunset. Is that literally true? No, scientifically that's not true. But we say that every single day. right? We say that every single day. So in light of what I was starting to talk about, different truth propositions that are in the God Save the King narrative, in the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, and like I said, Luke in particular is poked a lot of fun at for quote unquote being a poor historian, because they look at, for example, a significant example is the census of Quirinius, right? That if you go to the Gospel of Luke and it says, in the days of Caesar Augustus, there went out a decree that all the world should be registered, okay? Not necessarily taxed, not necessarily a census. It could be either or both of those things. It could be either or both of those things, but it is not necessarily either or both of those things. See, here we go. This is all what we're talking about with regard to, are we superimposing an idea on the text that isn't there? Okay, because the Greek word simply means a registration. That's all it means. It means a registration. Now, was it a kind of census? Probably. Was it a kind of taxation? Maybe. Was it a registration? Absolutely, because that's the word that is in the Greek text. It is definitely a registration. Was it a census? Maybe. Was it a tax? Maybe. We don't know for sure. But the reason the skeptics have a field day with this record is because it says that this census took place in the days of Quirinius, when he was governor of Roman Syria. Okay. Now we have a fair amount of legitimate historical documentation about Quirinius. We know who this guy was, and what we do know for certain is that he was the governor of Syria at a later date, okay? And that at that later date, he conducted a census. Okay, that we know. That one's pretty much, here you go, to use a funny colloquialism, that's etched in stone, because back then that's how you wrote. Okay, that's why we have certain records, is because we're finding clay tablets, tombstones, things like that, where things literally are etched in stone, right? So we do know that at a later time, Quirinius was governor of Syria, and that he held a census at that time. Well, if that's all you know and that's all you have to go off of, then it's tempting. See, now this, so Mr. Skeptic out there, you don't have complete information necessarily. Okay. What about the other census that took place? Okay. Well, no other census took place because we have no record. You don't know that. Okay. Now I get it. Don't get me wrong. I get it. I can't just make up, well, it's possible that there was another census and therefore the Bible's right. I can't just make it up. But there is other evidence that points towards another registration. And there's plenty of it. Okay. So see, that's the thing, is that now when you do historical research about Quirinius, you discover that, and when you look at the Bible, right, the biblical record doesn't call him the governor of Syria. It calls him a governor in Syria. Okay. So that means he was not necessarily the governor of Syria. He was a governor. He was a leader who had duties in and around Syria, or what would properly be called Coel Syria, which means all of Syria, which to the Roman thinking of which Judea was a part. Okay. Now you got to think, and see, you got to think this way too. Are we talking about when Luke wrote his gospel, or are we talking about when Jesus was born? Because there's a 50-year difference right there. between when Luke wrote it down and between when the events actually happened. And that's a significant amount of time. So when Luke writes, in the days of Caesar Augustus, there went out a decree that the whole world should be taxed. See, and there's another one. The whole world. The whole world. Now, boy, want to talk about a loaded gun. What an interesting statement, because what it means is it means the known world to that culture, right? The known world to the writer, right? And the readers. So who's the writer? Who are the readers? Who is Luke's intended audience? What did Luke know? What did his audience know? And is it scientifically accurate? See, so here's that question again with regard to the doctrine of inerrancy. Well, we know that that wasn't the whole world. We know that. And yet anybody with a brain also knows that that is here you go again, the poetic use of language. It's a phrase that refers to the known world, which is not just the Roman world, because the Roman world, and which on one hand, it is the Roman world, because how is Caesar Augustus going to register anybody outside the Roman world, right? So on one hand, it is the Roman world, but on the other hand, the known world extends beyond the Roman Empire. The Romans knew about lands to the far, far east that today we would call China. Okay? There was a very interesting trade relation between China and Rome, hence the Silk Road. And I'll get into that some other time. We'll do an entirely separate episode on the beginnings of and then the development and history of the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road didn't hit its heyday until 1,000 years later. That's when the Silk Road was at its peak, was in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, before it got closed down, right? Due to because depending upon which empire controls which section of the road, that determines whether it's open or not, right? So the Silk Road largely got closed down in later history because of who was controlling it, right? But in the time frame that we are looking at, okay, so late 1st century BC or early 1st century AD, okay, the Silk Road was open. It was heavily taxed by the Parthian Empire because they were the middleman. They were the middle ground. So China couldn't get goods to Mesopotamia or the Near East or Europe without going through the middle territory, right? And it included both land routes and maritime routes that went via water, right? So there might be some openings if you went around, okay? But by the way, side note here, this is where we get the phrase Near East and Far East, okay? It's in reference to ancient Greco-Roman culture. Those terms come from an ancient Greco-Roman perspective. So if you lived in Greece, or you lived in Italy, you lived in Rome or Athens or any of that part of the Mediterranean, then you referred to what would be modern Turkey, modern Syria, Judea, and Jordan. That was the Near East, okay? And then the Far East, that was what we would call Tibet and China, Mongolia, right? That was the Far East. And then, to be blunt, I don't know what they called Central Asia. I have no idea what they called that. If they had, because the term Middle East is actually a modern term. It's not an ancient term. The Romans and the Greeks didn't use the phrase Middle East, to the best of my knowledge. Now, here we go. You show me the evidence, I'll change my mind, right? So, but Near East and Far East, that's a Greco-Roman term. Near East meant Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Israel. It also included Egypt, by the way, because the idea was that was quote unquote East, even though it was predominantly South, right? And then the Far East was China. You had a very significant trade relationship with silk from China and glassware from Rome. The Romans apparently were really, really good at mass production of glass. Who knew, right? Chinese, the ancient Chinese, the Han Dynasty primarily, were very good at the mass production of silk. And the two, thousands of miles apart, loved each other's products. The Romans loved silk. Not that they couldn't get silk from other areas. You could get silk from Turkey, right? But the silk from China was vastly superior, right? So the Romans loved silk and the Chinese loved glass. So those were two of the items that went back and forth from Rome to China in the late 1st century BC. Okay, so now back to what I was talking about. The census of Quirinius, or the registration of Quirinius, right? I absolutely believe that he did conduct one. He conducted a registration, and that's because of his role as a governor in Coel, Syria. At the time, Mary would have been pregnant, and then Jesus would have been born, because at that time they were preparing to bestow upon Augustus the title of Pater Patriae, which means the father of the country. And this was a great honor, and the Senate was going to bestow this honor upon him, and therefore it would have required the consensus, interesting term, it would have required the consensus of the dominant Roman citizens and dominant client kingdoms throughout the empire. So therefore, you would have had to have collected a registration, or frankly, signatures from around the empire, so that the Senate could say, we, the people of Rome, bestow upon you, Augustus, the title of Pater Patriae, the father of the country, right? See, so this is stuff I learned when I first started studying God Save the King. I didn't know that, right? I had no clue. Here's another one. Let's talk about this. The script, see, and here you go. This is very important when it comes to read the Bible again for the first time. I have talked about this for years with a slightly different understanding, and now I have an even better understanding. But I pointed out for years the fact that the Bible never says that Jesus was born in a stable. It never says that. It says he was laid in a manger. It does not say born in a stable. Look at the record. Look at the record, read it carefully. Never says it, never says it, never says it. And in case I haven't made myself clear, it never says it. It never says born in a stable. It says laid in a manger. And those two things are not the same. They're not the same at all. And this is a brilliant example of imposing our modern Western understanding on an ancient Eastern book. This is a brilliant example of this, because if you ask yourself, well, what is a manger, right? Well, a manger is either a food trough for animals, or it is a water trough for animals, either or both, right? Now, that part we understand. That part is accurate. It's a food trough for animals. Okay, that's what a manger is. That part we have essentially correct, because there's a detail or two that matters, right? But to a Western mind, especially to a modern Western mind, where do you find a food trough for animals? Well, you either find it in the like I used to work horses. I lived in Colorado, and I used to feed horses on a daily basis, right? And what I did is I gathered up bales of hay in the back of the truck, and I drove over to the pasture, and I tossed out flakes of hay off the bale, flakes off the bale for the horses to eat. And I didn't even actually put the food in a trough, right? And the ranch I worked on, we didn't have a huge number of horses, so we fed them grain, and then so therefore what we did is we just put the grain in buckets, right? So I got a dozen buckets of grain in the back of the truck and 2 or 3 bales of hay, and I'm throwing off flakes off the bales, and then I park the truck and I drop off the buckets, and the horses come up and they eat out of the bucket, right? But the point being is that to modern Western thinking, where do we presume that you find a food trough? Well, we presume that you find it in a stable, right? Makes sense. And I mean, I'm picturing the ranch where I worked. In my mind, there was a stable right there. There was the tack shop. There's the stable. There's the pasture. Here's the water trough, right? Here's the horses, right? Sometimes I did have to put the horses in the stable. Sometimes I did feed them in the stable, right? Once again, flakes of hay, buckets for the grain, right? Were there food troughs there? Sure. Reasonable expectation. Okay. But that's all modern Western thinking. Where was a manger in ancient Eastern thinking? What was was it the same? Do we presume? Because there it is. This is a perfect example of us presuming that they did it the same. Brilliant example of us assuming, presuming, and therefore imposing and superimposing on the ancient Eastern text a modern Western idea, when the truth is the animal troughs, food troughs for animals, number one, they were tended to be made out of stone. That doesn't mean they were never made out of wood, but they tended to be made out of stone, right? Which means you didn't move those around easily. Doesn't mean they couldn't be moved, but generally speaking, you didn't move them, and they were made out of stone because that meant that the animal couldn't knock it over, right? And many times they were made out of stone because they were literally dug right into the earth itself, okay, is what the farmer, rancher, or frankly just a homeowner would do if he's got some household animals, is he would cut a ledge into the earth. He would cut a ledge into the earth about 3 feet high, and then he would dig a trough shape into the earth. So now an animal could just walk up, he's right there at the 3-foot ledge, and lean over and eat food out of the trough. Not a problem, right? Create a ledge, dig the trough right into the earth. There you go. Stone manger, stone food trough for animals. Now, if you put a roof over it and walls around it, it's inside a house, which ironically is exactly how they did it. That was a very, very, very common method of keeping household animals and feeding household animals, is that you would have a large one-room house, and at one end they would cut down into the earth. They'd create this ledge, and then they would cut, square or oval-shaped indentations into the bedrock that would become the trough or the manger. The point being is that the manger was literally in the living room. Literally in the living room. So here you go. So there you go, right? So think about what we've been talking about. Back to the quote unquote doctrine of inerrancy. Well, once again, what do we mean by inerrancy? Do we mean grammatical, perfection? Do we mean factual perfection, scientific perfection, or do we mean a truth proposition that there's a truth that is being intended to be communicated, but it is not necessarily the exact method of interpretation. And that can be affected by the distinction between a modern Western culture and an ancient Eastern culture, that a manger is an entirely different concept today as it was then. Okay, so what is the truth proposition that Luke is putting forward? He was wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger. Well, that's true. That hasn't changed. But what we have to be very careful about is when we try to say he was born in a stable. Okay? Because the record does not say that he was born in a stable. It says he was laid in a manger. So this is a great example of what Scripture says and what Scripture does not say, and how we have to think about it and guard ourselves against imposing modern expectations on an ancient text. Very, very, very important. Okay? So these are several ideas that make great examples of exactly what I'm talking about. The registration of Quirinius, right? That we do have significant evidence of a registration that was conducted in conjunction with the bestowal of the honorary title Father of the Country, Pater Patrae, on Augustus Caesar, and that would have occurred. Here you go, because now, right, we know through historical records that title was conferred upon him in early 2 BC, in February, at the Festival of Concordia in February of 2 BC. Okay, well, that means that the registration itself had to have gone out, what, 6-9 months, a year earlier, right? And that this is the registration, I believe, right? Now, here you go. Do we absolutely know this for an absolute certainty? No, we don't. We don't know it for an absolute certainty. And once again, I reserve the right to change my mind if I get better information. But to the best of my understanding, this makes complete sense. That there was a registration in the spring of 3 BC, that this would have been the registration that was responded to by Joseph and Mary, that when they got word of this registration, that they moved to Bethlehem. Not traveled there with intent to travel back. They moved. They relocated. And why did they relocate? They relocated because they knew the prophecy that the Messiah must be born in Bethlehem. And did they have any intention of going back to Nazareth? Initially, no. We are told why that happened. And we are told that that was because when they left Judea and moved to Egypt and then came back, they learned that Archelaus, Herod's son, was ruling Judea in his father's place, and they were concerned that this might attract the wrong kind of attention. So therefore, they went to Nazareth. And when you read this record at the end of chapter 2 in the infancy narrative in Luke, the temptation is to think that they went immediately, but that's not true. We'll get into that in another episode about reading the Bible again for the first time, that there are gaps. So here you go again, right? So once again, we're back to this whole issue of how do you define inerrancy? How do you define it, right? Because in late chapter 2, it's just late chapter 2, which is where, of Luke, right? Which is where we are told that they go back to, no, it's Matthew. What am I thinking? Pardon me, excuse me, right? Because Matthew is the record, okay, where they No, it's both. That's what I'm doing this from memory, so forgive me here, guys. But it's actually both. So it's Matthew chapter 2 and it's Luke chapter 2, because Luke deals primarily with the birth of Jesus and the arrival of the shepherds. Matthew deals primarily with the arrival of the Magi, which occurred 15 months later. But with the arrival of the Magi, that's also when when Joseph gets the dream to leave, to go to Egypt, and then later when Herod dies, to come back. And then that's when we read that when they came back to Judea, well, why'd they come back to Judea? If their intention was to go back to Nazareth, why did they even bother, stopping in Judea? Now, there might be interesting reasons that are conjecture in light of the route they took, right? But if their intent was to go to Galilee the whole time, then why didn't they take the Via Maris, which is the way of the sea, right? Which was the major road closest to the sea. If they're coming from Egypt, and where did they live in Egypt, by the way? We don't know precisely. Now, it stands to reason that they probably lived in the Jewish section of Alexandria. Why wouldn't they? Okay, but we don't know that for certain either. There's certain conjecture and theories about that, but if that's the case, then the Via Maris, the way of the sea, if their intent was to go to Galilee, would have made the most sense. So why detour into Judea unless their intent was to go back to Judea, because that was where they moved to, because that's where Jesus needed to be born, because they knew that was the prophecy, that the Messiah had to be born in Bethlehem. But we actually don't have real indication that they immediately intended to go back to Galilee and Nazareth, right? So now when you read at the end of Luke chapter 2, that's when you read where it looks like, because Luke chapter 2 talks about Mary's purification and things like that. And then in English, key word here, in English, it appears, keyword, it appears to read that having completed all things according to the law of Moses, they went to Galilee. Now, I deliberately said that incorrectly. Because the Greek and the Aramaic do not read having completed everything according to the law, they returned to Nazareth. It says, and when they returned, they completed everything according to the law, then they returned to Nazareth, right? Very important distinction, because one makes it look like it was right away. The other one tells you there were still more things they needed to do. And that's the one that it really was. It wasn't, and having completed all things according to the law. That's the one that it's not. It doesn't read that. It reads when they completed, and when they completed all things according to the law, then they went back to Nazareth. See, so this is really, really critical when it comes to understanding the scripture. What does it say and what doesn't it say? And then the true science and art here is, can we fill in the blanks accurately? And that's the tricky part. And that's what we mean by read the Bible again for the first time. Stop, slow down, reread, read accurately, think about what you're thinking about. Let the Holy Spirit show you what is being said. And I'm going to wrap up with this. We only got a couple of minutes here, but I'm going to wrap up with this. I have yet to comment about the television series, The Chosen. I haven't said a word about it. And that's because there's a lot of people out there who love The Chosen, and there's a lot of people out there that don't like it so much. There's a lot of critics, a lot of skeptics who don't like it. There's a lot of Christians who love it. Okay. Now, I'm not going to try to hide my opinion. I'm not going to try to play that. I'm going to try to be objective, but I'm not going to try to hide my opinion, which is that I like it. Okay. I enjoy it. And why do I enjoy it? I enjoy it because they're doing exactly what I'm talking about. This is one of the reasons I enjoy it so much, is because they are forcing us to rethink the stories that we think we know. We think we know these stories, but what they're doing at The Chosen, what Dallas Jenkins is doing, is they are using artistic license to fill in the blanks in a manner in which, do we know absolutely it happened this way? No, not necessarily. But could it have happened this way? Yes, it could have, right? The example that happens to be bouncing around in my head right now, and there's several of them, is what they're doing with the character that they have named Gaius, the centurion, the Roman centurion that they've named Gaius, who then becomes the centurion of Matthew 8, whose servant is healed by Jesus. They're doing, in my opinion, they're doing a great job, because they're taking a story that we think we know and treating it in a way to make us rethink what we think we know. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've got to wrap it up there. We are out of time. I do want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. God save the King.